The ground splits open like a wound carved by the gods themselves. A sound beyond human comprehension tears through the African sky, not thunder, not wind, but the earth itself screaming in agony. In the span of 7 heartbeats, entire valleys vanish into darkness while mountains birth themselves from nothing. In this apocalyptic dawn, a female Homo habilis clings to a dying tree as the world she knows disappears beneath her. Her species numbers in the thousands across the vast continent. By sunrise, only dozens will remain. This is not just the story of survival. It is the story of the day the Earth merely succeeded in erasing humanity from existence before it had truly begun. The day when our ancestors faced extinction not from predators or disease, but from the planet itself turning against its own children. Welcome to the most terrifying night in human history. The morning air hung thick with moisture and the promise of rain when the first tremor shook the acacia trees. Zara, a female Homo habilis, whose name existed only in the clicks and grunts of her primitive language, felt the vibration travel up through her knuckles as she knuckle-walked across the drought-cracked earth. The East African Rift Valley stretched endlessly before her, a landscape of golden grasslands punctuated by thorny trees and scattered waterholes that had sustained her people for countless generations. The sky burned orange and red with the approaching dawn, painting the scattered clouds in shades of blood that seemed prophetic in hindsight. Her tribe had made camp near a cluster of fever trees, their yellow bark glowing like torches in the early light. 23 individuals in total, men, women, and children, who represented one of the last pure bloodlines of early humanity. They had no knowledge of their significance in the cosmic timeline, no understanding that they carried within their primitive skulls the seeds of civilization itself. Zara paused at the edge of a small stream, her reflection wavering in water that tasted of minerals and ancient secrets. Her face was a bridge between the animal past and human future, heavy brow ridge shadowing intelligent eyes, powerful jaw-housing teeth adapted for varied diet, hands that could grip stones as tools but not yet create art. The second tremor was stronger. Birds exploded from the fever trees in a cacophony of panicked wing beats and warning cries. Elephants trumpeted in the distance, their massive forms visible as gray shadows moving with uncharacteristic urgency across the plains. Even the ever-present insects fell silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Ngalakam, her mate Tulu, grunted from behind her. The words meant ground angry in their limited vocabulary, but his tone carried implications their language couldn't yet express: dread, confusion, and the primitive understanding that something fundamental was wrong with their world. Zara turned to see the entire tribe emerging from their crude shelters of woven grass and animal hide. The children clung to their mothers, their large eyes darting nervously between the trembling earth and the increasingly agitated sky. The elders, those ancient survivors who had lived perhaps 30 summers, stood motionless, their weathered faces etched with the kind of fear that came from experiencing events that had no explanation. The third tremor split the earth. A crack appeared at Zara's feet, no wider than her thumb, but perfectly straight, as if drawn by some cosmic hand. It raced across the ground with the speed of a hunting cheetah, dividing their campsite in half and continuing toward the horizon without deviation or hesitation. Aktal! Aktal! The warning cry came from Moru, the tribe's scout, as he pointed toward the distant mountains. What he saw there defied every natural law their primitive minds could comprehend. The peaks were moving, not shifting or settling as mountains sometimes did after storms, but actually rising, growing, pushing toward the sky like living things awakening from eternal slumber. Steam and smoke poured from newly formed cracks in their faces, carrying the sulphurous stench of the earth's molten heart. But it was the sound that truly terrified them. A low, rumbling moan emerged from the rising peaks, growing in volume and intensity until it seemed to emanate from the planet's core itself. It was a sound of pain so profound and alien that it bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the deepest survival instincts buried in their reptilian brains. The earth was screaming. Zara felt her knees buckle as the fourth tremor, stronger than the others combined, rolled beneath them like a massive underground creature turning in its sleep. The fever trees swayed impossibly far from vertical, their roots audibly straining against soil that had begun to behave like liquid. That's when she saw them, other tribes in the distance, scattered across the valley floor like ants fleeing a disturbed nest. Dark figures ran in all directions, some carrying possessions, others carrying children, most carrying nothing but terror. The sight sent ice through her veins as she realized the scope of what was happening. This was not a localized phenomenon. The entire Rift Valley, perhaps the entire continent, was convulsing in geological agony. "Kuzen now," Tulu said, his voice barely audible above the growing rumble. "We must run." But his eyes showed the futility of such a suggestion. Where could they run when the very ground beneath their feet had become their enemy? As if responding to his question, the horizon erupted. A pillar of fire and rock shot into the sky from what had been, moments before, a peaceful grassland. The explosion was so bright it temporarily blinded them, so loud it left their primitive ears ringing with phantom sounds. Chunks of molten stone began raining down around them, each one trailing fire and smoke as it fell. The children began to wail, not the normal crying of frightened young, but the soul-deep keening of creatures who sensed their own extinction approaching. The sound was picked up by other tribes across the valley, creating a chorus of despair that seemed to answer the earth's screaming with their own. Zara grabbed her infant son, pressing his small form against her chest, as she made the decision that would echo through 6.4 million years of human evolution. They couldn't outrun this catastrophe, but perhaps they could outlast it. Talmur Kesh. She screamed above the chaos, using words that meant high ground seek. It was the most complex strategic thinking her species had yet achieved. The understanding that elevation might provide safety from ground-level destruction. But as the tribe gathered their few possessions and began running toward the distant hills, Zara looked back one final time at the valley that had been their ancestral home. What she saw there would haunt her primitive dreams for the rest of her brief life. The earth had opened like a massive mouth, revealing depths that glowed with hellish red light. And rising from those depths, carried on winds that smelled of sulfur and death, came shapes that shouldn't exist. Shadows that moved independent of any light source, forms that seemed to mock the very concept of natural law. Something else lived in the earth's depths, something that was using this geological chaos as an opportunity to emerge into the surface world, something that viewed the struggling human tribes not as fellow inhabitants of the planet, but as prey. The hills offered no sanctuary. As Zara's tribe climbed the rocky slopes, their primitive hands bleeding from sharp stones and thorny scrub, the ground beneath them continued its relentless convulsions. Each tremor sent loose rocks cascading down like deadly rain, forcing them to press against cliff faces and pray to gods they had not yet learned to name. Behind them, the Rift Valley had become a vision of hell. Geysers of molten rock erupted at random intervals, creating temporary volcanoes that would burn fiercely for minutes before collapsing back into the earth. The air itself had turned toxic, a choking mixture of ash, sulfur, and something else that made their primitive lungs burn with each labored breath. But it was the sounds that truly unnerved them. Beyond the earth's geological screaming, beyond the crash of falling stones and the roar of newborn fires, came something else. Clicking, skittering, the unmistakable sound of many legs moving in coordinated patterns across stone surfaces. "Mantala Kreshne," whispered Nala, the tribe's eldest female, her ancient voice trembling with a fear that transcended the merely physical. The words meant darkness brings death, But her tone suggested she was naming something specific, something her grandmother's grandmother had spoken of in whispered legends. Around dying fires. Zara paused in her climb, infant still clutched to her chest, and pressed her ear against the rock face. The clicking was coming from inside the hill itself. Not from surface creatures disturbed by the chaos, but from vast networks of tunnels that honeycombed the earth beneath their feet. Tunnels that had been sealed for millennia. Tunnels that were now breaking open. The first emergence happened 50 yards below them. A section of hillside simply crumbled away, revealing a perfectly circular opening that exhaled air so cold it formed visible vapor in the volcanic heat. For a moment, nothing emerged. Then the clicking intensified, accompanied by a new sound scraping, as if massive claws were testing their grip on stone. What crawled out of that hole defied every natural category their primitive brains could construct. It was roughly the size of a large lion, but there the similarity ended. Its body was segmented like an insect's, covered in chitinous plates that reflected the hellish light like black mirrors. 8 legs, each ending in claws that could anchor in solid rock, propelled it with fluid grace across surfaces that would challenge even the most adapted mountain dwellers. But it was the head that inspired true horror. Where a predator should have eyes, this creature possessed clusters of holes that dilated and contracted independently, sampling air and sound and perhaps senses for which humans had no names. Its mouth was a complex arrangement of mandibles and grinding surfaces that clicked in rhythmic patterns. Not random animal sounds, but something that carried the structure of communication. It was talking to others of its kind. Sektar. Tulu screamed, using the word for nightmare, though it was inadequate for what they witnessed. The creature had spotted them, its sensory holes focusing with predatory intent on their huddled group. When it moved faster than any surface predator they had ever encountered. The tribe scattered. Evolutionary programming kicked in, overriding group loyalty with individual survival instinct. Each member sought their own path up the crumbling hillside, abandoning the collective strength that had kept their species alive for thousands of years. But the creature wasn't hunting randomly. It moved with purpose, intelligence, selecting its target with careful consideration. Its choice was coldly logical. It went for the weakest. Little Kesh, barely old enough to walk steadily, stumbled as his mother lost her grip on his small hand. The child fell, rolling down the loose scree toward the waiting predator. His terrified crying echoed off the rock walls, a sound that would haunt the survivor's primitive dreams. What happened next would be carved into humanity's genetic memory, a template of horror that would influence their nightmares for millions of years to come. The creature didn't simply kill the child. It studied him first, its mandibles clicking in complex patterns, as if analyzing his biological structure. When it finally struck, it was with surgical precision. The mandibles pierced specific points on the small body, injecting something that made the child's screams stop abruptly, not from death, but from paralysis. Then it began to feed. Not like a scavenger tearing flesh, but like a scientist conducting an experiment. It consumed the child in a systematic pattern, leaving certain organs untouched while completely devouring others. Most horrifying of all, the child remained conscious throughout the process, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. Kameth Dal. Zara found herself screaming, her maternal instincts overriding survival programming. The words meant, "Leave him alone," but carried emotional weight their primitive language couldn't properly express: rage, desperation, and the first stirrings of what would eventually become human concepts of justice and moral outrage. But her cries only attracted attention. More holes were opening in the hillside around them, each one disgorging another of the underground predators. They moved in coordinated patterns, communicating through their clicking language, executing what was clearly a planned hunt rather than random predation. As the creatures surrounded the scattered tribe members, Zara made a realization that would echo through evolutionary history. These things weren't just predators. They were intelligent. They had language, strategy, and perhaps most terrifying of all, they had patience. They had been waiting down there for generations, possibly for centuries, for the right moment to emerge. The geological chaos wasn't just an opportunity. It was their invitation to return to the surface world their ancestors had once ruled. Tal Keshmore, she whispered to her infant son, the words meaning, "We go up more." But even as she spoke, she could see the futility of their situation. Above them, the hillside grew steeper and more unstable. Below them, the creatures were methodically harvesting the slowest and weakest of their kind. That's when Tulu appeared beside her, his powerful hands gripping a chunk of volcanic rock that glowed with internal heat. His eyes held something she had never seen before, not just fear or anger, but understanding. He had realized what she had realized. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a test. "Unkal Vesh," he growled, showing her his makeshift weapon. "Fight back." It was perhaps the first time in human history that someone had chosen to confront rather than flee from a superior predator. The decision would prove to be evolutionary significant, marking the moment when intelligence began to matter more than physical strength in the struggle for survival. But as the underground hunters closed in, their clicking growing louder and more excited, both Zara and Tulu wondered if intelligence would be enough to overcome creatures that had evolved in the Earth's steppes for millions of years, perfecting their hunting techniques while humanity's ancestors were still learning to use their opposable thumbs. The answer would determine whether their species lived to see another dawn, or join the countless others that had vanished into the Earth's screaming maw. The makeshift weapon in Tulu's hand was more than stone. It was the birth of human ingenuity under pressure. The volcanic rock, still warm from the Earth's molten heart, had naturally sharp edges where it had fractured during its violent ejection from the depths. As he gripped it, his primitive brain made connections that would echo through millions of years of technological development. "Komeshtar!" he roared at the approaching creature, his voice carrying harmonics of challenge that their species had never before directed at a superior predator. The words meant, "I have teeth too." But the concept behind them was revolutionary. The idea that tools could make the weak strong, the hunted into hunters. The closest underground predator paused, its sensory holes dilating as it processed this unexpected response. In its species experience, surface dwellers fled or submitted when confronted. This standing of ground, this display of artificial fangs, was an evolutionary development it had not encountered. Zara watched the confrontation with her infant clutched against her chest. But her primitive mind was processing information at speeds her species had never achieved. The creature's hesitation revealed something crucial. They were adapted for hunting prey that behaved predictably. They had evolved in a stable ecosystem where behaviors followed established patterns. But humanity's defining characteristic was its unpredictability. Tesh Morau, she called to the scattered survivors, her voice carrying across the chaotic hillside. "Rocks. Find rocks." The concept of coordinated tool use was being born in real time, forced into existence by circumstances that demanded innovation or extinction. Around the hillside, the handful of surviving tribe members began to understand. Those who could reach loose stones grabbed them, following Tulu's example. Those who couldn't find rocks improvised broken tree branches, sharp fragments of bone from earlier meals, even handfuls of the caustic ash that continued to rain from the erupting valley. For the first time in the planet's history, primitive humans were choosing to fight as a coordinated group rather than flee as scattered individuals. The underground hunters responded with increased clicking, their communication becoming more rapid and complex. This was clearly a development they needed to discuss, analyze, adapt to. Their predatory behavior had been perfected over millions of years of hunting creatures that followed predictable patterns. These surface dwellers were breaking those patterns. The first thrown rock struck the lead predator in its cluster of sensory holes. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent, a shriek that combined pain with surprise, followed by a charge that covered the distance to Tulu in 3 fluid bounds. Its claws scraped sparks from stone as it launched itself through the air, mandibles spread wide to deliver a paralyzing strike. But Tulu was no longer the same primitive human who had awakened that morning. Desperation and necessity had accelerated his cognitive development, forcing neural pathways to form that might normally have taken generations to establish. He didn't just swing his weapon, he calculated trajectory, timing, and force with the precision of an engineer. The volcanic rock connected with the creature's head with a sound like breaking pottery. The predator's charge became a tumbling crash as it struck the hillside, green fluid leaking from cracks in its chitinous skull. It wasn't dead, but it was hurt, and more importantly, it was afraid. The other creatures began to retreat toward their tunnel openings, but not in panic. Their withdrawal was organized, tactical, the movement of a military unit regrouping rather than a pack of animals fleeing. They had learned something about these surface dwellers, and they needed time to process this information, to adapt their hunting strategies. But as the immediate threat receded, a new horror revealed itself. The geological convulsions had not ceased during the battle. If anything, they had intensified, as if the planet's agony had deepened with each passing moment. The entire hillside was now unstable, with massive cracks appearing in the rock face above them. Steam hissed from dozens of new fissures, carrying the sulfurous breath of the underworld to the surface. Mesh Kolterves, Nala, the eldest, spoke with the authority of accumulated wisdom. Earth bleeds. We must find the safe place. But her eyes, ancient and experienced, showed the terrible truth. There might no longer be any safe places left in their world. That's when Zara noticed something that changed everything. The cracks in the hillside weren't random. They followed patterns, geometric arrangements that spoke of intelligence and purpose. Someone or something had been carving these channels for a long time, creating a network that covered the entire mountain range. The underground creatures hadn't just been waiting for the geological chaos. They had been causing it. Vesh Talmar, she whispered, the words carrying a horror that their primitive language couldn't adequately express. They made this happen. The implications struck the survivors like physical blows. The earthquakes, the volcanic eruptions, the systematic destruction of their world, all of it had been engineered by an intelligence that had been planning this extermination for generations, perhaps centuries. Their species wasn't facing a natural disaster. They were experiencing a coordinated genocide. As this realization sank in, the remaining tribe members, now numbering only 12 out of the original 23, faced a choice that would define the future of human evolution. They could continue fleeing, hoping to outrun a catastrophe that covered continents, or they could accept that their only chance of survival lay in understanding and confronting the intelligence that sought their extinction. Tulu still gripped his bloodied weapon, his primitive features set in lines of determination that wouldn't look out of place on a modern soldier's face. "If they make Earth angry," he said slowly, working through concepts his vocabulary couldn't quite handle, "then we make Earth angry back." It was the birth of warfare, not as random violence, but as organized resistance to organized oppression. But as the survivors began their descent toward the valley floor, now armed with their crude weapons and their revolutionary understanding that intelligence could triumph over brute force, they didn't realize they were walking into the most carefully laid trap in evolutionary history. The underground hunters had learned from their first encounter. They had adapted their strategy, modified their approach, and prepared a welcome for these unexpectedly resourceful surface dwellers. The real hunt was about to begin. And this time, the prey wouldn't get away so easily. The descent into the valley was a journey through an alien landscape. Where once familiar grasslands had stretched to the horizon, Now a hellscape of cooling lava flows created a maze of steaming corridors and treacherous chasms. The air itself had become an enemy thick with ash that clogged their primitive respiratory systems and laced with gases that made their crude thoughts sluggish and confused. But Zara's mind had been fundamentally altered by the morning's revelations. The realization that their catastrophe was artificially created had triggered cognitive leaps that shouldn't have been possible for another million years of natural evolution. She found herself thinking several moves ahead, anticipating consequences, planning for contingency skills that marked the true beginning of human strategic intelligence. Mevek Talish, she called softly to the remaining survivors, her voice barely audible above the geological chaos around them. The words meant stay close, but carried implications of coordinated movement that were entirely new to their species' vocabulary. The 12 survivors moved through the transformed landscape like a primitive military unit, spacing themselves at intervals that prevented mass casualties from falling rocks. Using hand signals Tulu had improvised to communicate without alerting potential predators. And most revolutionary of all, taking turns as scouts and rearguards to protect the group's most vulnerable members. They were evolving behaviorally in real time, compressed evolution driven by necessity and guided by intelligence that hadn't existed in their species hours before. But their underground enemies had been evolving for much longer. The first sign of the trap was subtle, too subtle for any natural predator to have conceived. Small piles of volcanic rocks had been arranged at regular intervals along their path, each one positioned to offer tempting shelter or defensive positions. To exhausted, traumatized survivors seeking any advantage in their hostile environment, these arrangements appeared to be gifts from fortune. Zara's enhanced awareness noticed what her companions missed. The rock piles were too regular, too perfectly positioned, too conveniently useful. In the span of a few hours, her primitive brain had developed a capacity for paranoid analysis, the ability to see malevolent intelligence behind seemingly random events. Kesh Dalmore, she warned, pointing at the nearest rock pile. Not natural. The concept of deliberate deception was so new to their species that she struggled to express it in their limited vocabulary. But before she could elaborate, the trap sprang. The ground beneath 3 of their numbers simply vanished, revealing carefully disguised pitfalls that had been carved from solid rock with precision their species could not imagine achieving. The survivors who fell didn't scream. They simply disappeared into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. From the depths came the familiar clicking, but now it carried different tones, satisfaction, coordination, and something that chilled the remaining humans to their primitive cores. The underground creatures were communicating in what could only be described as laughter. Vash Kultum, Tulu snarled, his improvised weapon ready as he backed away from the pit edges. But his anger was mixed with a new emotion respect. Their enemies weren't just predators. They were architects of destruction, engineers of extinction who had been planning this extermination for longer than his species had existed. The remaining 9 survivors found themselves surrounded by evidence of intelligence that dwarfed their own. The entire valley floor had been prepared as a hunting ground, with every apparent shelter revealing itself as a trap. Every promising path leading to carefully constructed kill zones. But the underground hunters had made one crucial miscalculation. They had evolved their intelligence in isolation, perfecting their strategies against creatures that followed predictable behaviors. They had never faced a species capable of learning from defeat, of adapting their responses based on new information, of becoming more dangerous precisely because they had been underestimated. Talmeshvek, Zara called to her companions, her voice carrying authority that hadn't existed in human social structures before that day. She was directing them to abandon the paths entirely, to climb across the unstable surfaces of cooling lava flows where no traps could have been pre-positioned. It was an insanely dangerous strategy. The volcanic rock was still hot enough to burn flesh, unstable enough to collapse without warning. and sharp enough to cut through their tough hide. But it was also the one approach their enemies couldn't have anticipated. As they picked their way across the treacherous surface, leaving bloody footprints on stone that steamed with residual heat, the underground hunters were forced to emerge from their prepared positions to continue the pursuit. For the first time, the surface dwellers had forced their enemies to fight on equal terms, no traps, no prepared advantages, just intelligence against intelligence in a contest that would determine which species deserved to inherit the earth. The first direct confrontation came when one of the creatures attempted to cross the same lava field in pursuit. Its 8 legs, perfectly adapted for gripping stone, couldn't handle the heat and instability of the volcanic surface. It fell, its chitinous shell cracking against the sharp rock, green fluid leaking into crevices where it hissed and steamed. But instead of fleeing from the wounded predator, Tulu made a decision that would echo through evolutionary history. He turned back. Using his improvised weapon with surgical precision, he began systematically destroying the creature's sensory organs, not in random violence, but with calculated intent to learn about his enemy's vulnerabilities. Each strike was an experiment, each observation a piece of intelligence that might help his species survive. Crash more talvesh, he called to the others as he worked. Learn from it. Understand it. He was articulating, in primitive terms, the concept of tactical intelligence gathering, studying one's enemies to defeat them more effectively. The dying creature's mandibles clicked in patterns that seemed almost like speech, as if it were trying to communicate something crucial before death claimed it. Zara found herself leaning closer, her enhanced cognitive abilities struggling to parse meaning from the alien sounds. What she heard changed everything she thought she understood about their situation. The creature wasn't just communicating with its own kind. It was speaking to something else, something vast and patient that dwelt in the deepest parts of the earth. The clicks formed words in a language older than stone, and the words formed a message that chilled her to the bone. The surface awakening was not expected. Request new parameters for elimination protocol. Their enemies weren't just intelligent. They were taking orders from something even more intelligent. Something that viewed the entire surface world as an experiment to be controlled and modified as necessary. As the creature finally died, its last clicks echoing across the lava field, Zara realized that their struggle was far from over. They had defeated one level of intelligence, but there were deeper levels, older minds, ancient powers that had been manipulating evolution itself for eons. The question was no longer whether they could survive the underground hunters. The question was whether they could survive the attention of whatever had created the underground hunters in the first place. The lava field had become their fortress and their prison. As night fell over the devastated valley, the 9 remaining humans huddled together on a stable platform of cooled volcanic rock, surrounded by a landscape that glowed with hellish light. Steam rose from dozens of cracks and fissures, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to move with malevolent purpose through the darkness. But it was the silence that truly unnerved them. The clicking communication of the underground hunters had ceased entirely, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Even the geological chaos had quieted, as if whatever force had been driving the catastrophic upheaval was pausing to reassess the situation. Zara pressed her infant son closer to her chest, feeling his small body trembling with cold and fear. Around them, the other survivors sat in a circle, their primitive faces illuminated by the red glow of cooling magma. For the first time since the morning's chaos began, they had time to think, to process what they had experienced, to grapple with concepts their minds had never before been forced to consider. "Valkam Moresh," whispered Kira, one of the younger females, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of settling rock. The words meant, "What comes next?" but carried existential weight their language couldn't properly express. She was asking not just about their immediate survival, but about the future of their species in a world that had revealed itself to be far more hostile and complex than they had ever imagined. Before anyone could attempt an answer, the silence was broken by something that defied every natural law they understood. A voice spoke from the depths of the earth itself, not the clicking communication of the underground hunters, but actual speech in sounds that somehow bypassed their primitive ears and spoke directly to their consciousness. It was ancient beyond measure, patient beyond understanding, and utterly alien in its intelligence. Surface specimens display unexpected adaptive capacity, the voice said, its words forming inside their minds rather than reaching them through air vibrations. Evolutionary acceleration beyond predicted parameters requires intervention adjustment. The humans pressed closer together, their enhanced fear responses triggering flight instincts that had nowhere to direct themselves. They were trapped on their volcanic island, surrounded by enemies above and below, and now faced with intelligence so vast it could communicate directly with their thoughts. Local elimination protocol has proven insufficient, the voice continued, its tone carrying no more emotion than a natural force describing weather patterns. Implementing continental restructure parameters. Surface sterilization will be complete within 7 rotations. Tulu gripped his weapon with hands that shook not from fear but from rage, an emotion that had evolved far beyond its original parameters during their day of horror. "Who speaks?" he demanded, his primitive vocal cords struggling to form words adequate for addressing cosmic intelligence. "What wants us dead?" The response came with crushing weight. It drove them all to their knees on the hard volcanic stone. Images flooded their minds, visions of the planet's deep history that their brains should not have been capable of processing. They saw the Earth in its youth, when the continents were arranged differently and the sky burned with different colors. They witnessed the rise and fall of species that had achieved intelligence millions of years before humanity's first sparks of consciousness. And they saw the entity that spoke to them now, not a creature in any sense they could understand, but intelligence that had emerged from the planet's core itself. A mind born from the slow dance of molten metals and crushing pressures that existed in the deepest places, where rock became liquid and liquid became something beyond either state. It had been guiding evolution for eons, nurturing some species while exterminating others, shaping the development of life according to principles their primitive minds could barely glimpse. Humanity was just the latest experiment, and like many experiments before them, they had developed in unexpected directions that required correction. "We are the curator of possibilities," the entity spoke, its words carrying the weight of geological time. "We tend the garden of consciousness, pruning branches that grow beyond their proper bounds, nurturing those that show promise for the greater pattern." More visions flooded their awareness, glimpses of other species that had faced similar trials. Intelligent reptiles that had developed mathematics but not wisdom and were sterilized by engineered climate change. Aerial species that had achieved art but not empathy, eliminated by precisely targeted atmospheric modifications. Aquatic civilizations that had mastered technology but not cooperation, destroyed by carefully orchestrated ecological collapse. "Your species shows unusual characteristics," the curator continued, its attention focusing on them with intensity that made their enhanced consciousness feel like candle flames in a hurricane. "Rapid adaptation under pressure. Collective intelligence emerging from individual desperation. Tool use advancing beyond predicted evolutionary timelines." Zara found her voice, though speaking to cosmic intelligence felt like trying to argue with the movement of stars. "We want to live," she said, the words simple but carrying the weight of every human who would ever exist. "We want our children to live." "Survival desire is universal," the curator replied. "But survival without purpose leads to stagnation. Survival without limits leads to destruction. We have witnessed both outcomes countless times across the eons. The volcanic platform beneath them began to vibrate with new harmonics, as if the planet itself was preparing for another phase of transformation. Around the horizon, new volcanic eruptions began to bloom like deadly flowers, their light painting the night sky in shades of ending. "Your species will be preserved," the curator announced, its words carrying finality that felt like geological certainty. 24 individuals selected for optimal genetic diversity will survive the continental restructuring. They will be relocated to prepared environments where their development can continue under proper observation. The survivors looked at each other with a mixture of hope and horror. Salvation was being offered, but at the cost of their autonomy, their freedom to evolve according to their own choices, rather than some cosmic entity's experimental protocol. What about the others? Tulu demanded, his primitive sense of justice rebelling against selection processes he couldn't comprehend. What about our people who are dying? Acceptable losses in service of species preservation, the curator replied without the slightest change in emotional tone. Evolution requires sacrifice. Progress demands selection. Your species will continue, but only in forms that serve the greater purpose. It was then that Zara made the decision that would define humanity's relationship with authority for the next 6.4 million years. She looked at her infant son, at the faces of her companions, at the hellish landscape that surrounded their small island of survival, and chose defiance. "No," she said, her voice carrying conviction that surprised even herself. "We choose our own purpose. We make our own decisions about who lives and dies. We don't want salvation that costs our freedom." The silence that followed her words felt like the pause between lightning and thunder, pregnant with consequences too vast for mortal minds to fully grasp. When the curator finally spoke again, its voice carried something that might have been surprise or possibly respect. Interesting. This response was not among the predicted variables. Perhaps further observation is warranted before final implementation. The volcanic platform stopped shaking. Around the horizon, the new eruptions slowed their violent birth. For the first time since the morning's chaos began, the planet seemed to settle into something approaching stability. But the survivors knew their respite was temporary. They had gained time, not victory. And in that time, they would have to prove that a species could evolve wisdom quickly enough to match its intelligence, courage quickly enough to match its consciousness, and unity quickly enough to survive the attention of powers that viewed entire civilizations as nothing more than experimental subjects. The real test of humanity was about to begin. The night of the Great Screaming was not just a historical event. It was a demographic cataclysm for humanity's earliest ancestors. While the survivors of Zara's tribe would go on to propagate the species, they would do so from a drastically reduced population base, a genetic bottleneck that would permanently alter the course of human evolution. Before the event, the global population of Homo habilis was estimated to be in the low tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 30,000 individuals scattered across the African continent. This was not a large number, but it was a stable, self-sustaining population with enough genetic diversity to withstand localized pressures. The geological event and the emergence of the underground hunters changed everything. In a matter of hours, the vast majority of these early humans were wiped out. 99% of the global population of Homo habilis perished in the cataclysm. Only an estimated 300 individuals across the entire African continent survived. The species' effective breeding population was reduced to fewer than 100 individuals, a number that geneticists consider the minimum for a species to avoid extinction. This event is what modern anthropologists refer to as the Tulu bottleneck. It marks a crucial moment in the human story when our existence hung by a single, fraying thread. The surviving members of Zara's and other isolated tribes represented the entire future of our species. Their subsequent generations would be born from a minuscule gene pool, making humanity particularly susceptible to disease and environmental change. The genetic diversity of the modern human population, particularly in non-African populations, can be traced back to this singular, terrifying event. It is why, statistically speaking, any two humans on the planet today are more genetically similar to each other than two chimpanzees living in the same forest. Our entire species, regardless of race or origin, is a testament to the resilience of those few hundred survivors who endured the night the Earth screamed. Their story is not just a tale of survival. It is the statistical foundation of all of humanity, a reminder that every human alive today is a direct descendant of a group that was nearly erased from existence 6.4 million years ago.